Hey there, welcome to episode 75 of the Let's Innovate for Vegas audio program. I am your host, Managing Director of the Innovate for Vegas Foundation, Dan Hugo. We are recording this episode on Tuesday morning. That's July 23rd, 2024. It's around 11 a.m. Today we are going to talk about a little bit more, in fact, about our Agile for Volunteers effort and how it applies to the tessellation initiative with Project ACT, our autonomous cohort tessellation thing. There are some new terms to throw around, and I'm going to try to be consistent. I will make some small errors along the way, but eventually habits will form. Consistent use of language, a ubiquitous vocabulary is an important thing. It helps to diminish, hopefully completely remove potential for confusion, for changing the meaning of words. One might intend one meaning, another might believe another, and that can lead to miscommunication. So, today we will talk about Agile for Volunteer iterations, the connection, communication, collaboration that ideally will come from Project ACT and its tessellation initiative, and a couple of other things. Some progress is being made, and that is how we shall begin. Ideally, wherever you find your audio program, such as this one, you're able to track down the episode description. Within the episode description, there is a show notes section with some links, so you can check out the summary that I'm about to read to you. And there are 5 links. 3 of them are the usual suspects, and 2 directly relevant to today's episode. So let's get on with it. If I seem a little bit distracted, or if there's some weird pauses or production weirdness, over the weekend I did completely upgrade my main computer on which I produce this program and other things. The application I use for capturing this program, Audacity, is displaying some issues as I'm recording. Hopefully they're just cosmetic. The proof that it's recording blanks out, so the whole window goes completely blank. That's it's not a good feeling to see that, but ideally everything is still working just fine. It appears to be. Anyway, let's get on with the show then. The summary. Oh, by the way, before I do commence the typical flow, a reminder that the Innovate for Vegas Foundation is a Nevada nonprofit corporation, a 501c3 public charity. We are all volunteers. There's no compensation directed at any of the directors or governance. Nobody gets paid, not directly and not in cash. Ideally, there's a long tail that drives some of this. So, a summary of today's episode, a return, at least in today's episode, to talking about actual progress. A few weeks ago, I suggested that I should start talking about actually working and getting things done, advancing causes for our various initiatives. And I have commented several times that, and especially in the episode Order of Operations, priorities are never aligned with goals. And so the external priorities, prioritization, the things that are important for people outside of our organization as far as long-term, nobody's knocking on my door telling me what to do. But as far as long-term planning and some of the administrata, which was done late June, so there's a 990 to file with the IRS and some other minor administrata, but these are always distractions. The internal goals are things like our website and some other early beginnings of things. So where do they meet? Somewhere where there's never enough time. So, but today we can talk about some actual progress on action taken on our various projects or initiatives, project initiatives, toward completion. So trying to make some progress in general, right? or at least milestones. So maybe not completion anytime in the next days, weeks, but who can be sure? That's the nature of volunteer projects, which we might touch on a little bit here. The tessellation initiative is sort of meta, so it will fit into this discussion today. And so I didn't really quote the summary, kind of went off on some improv, but you get the idea. Now for the link section, the usual, like I said, our foundation website, our homepage, can be found at innovateforvegas.org. That is innovate, F-O-R, Vegas.org. No dashes, hyphens, spaces. The homepage, as I've said many times, is due for a refresh. It should be a little bit more user-friendly. It should be less terse and less dense. These are coming. Unfortunately, like I said, there's only so much time in the day, but it's on the list. It's on my list. At the top, it's on the general things that need to get done list, not at the top. Our GitHub organization on github.com/innovateforvegas, same thing, F-O-R. It's no digits, no spaces, no punctuation. Innovate for Vegas. On our GitHub organization, you can see our various projects, although the terminology will be changing. So initiatives are the top level efforts, and component projects take the form of different repositories in GitHub, and that will probably seem confusing at first, but we'll see. The Project Act organization. So in the GitHub jargon, you can be an individual or a organization. So an organization is multiple people with roles and so on. So Project Act is a organization currently driven by Innovate for Vegas. Others are invited. Ideally, there will be others participating. So Project Dash, so in this case, there is some punctuation. Project Act, and you can click on that link. We have two ongoing efforts. One, I would argue, is a component project of our organization infrastructure. It is the Agile for Volunteers principles, initiative, way of doing things. And so that can be found. It's a collection of documents. It's a collection of principles, methods, some acronyms, some GitHub compatible issue forms and workflow description, and a glossary that will hopefully help with the ubiquitous language concept. And so you can visit that at github.com/innovate4vegas/doc-agile-for volunteers. And finally, the tessellation, as in autonomous cohort tessellation, is an initiative for Project Act. You can find that at github.com/project-act, like we talked about, /OV-tessellation, TESSELLATION, OV-tessellation. OV stands for overview. It's your starting point, an overview, if you will, for the tessellation initiative. Project Act is a name, so the project versus initiative comparison doesn't really apply, but an initiative we'll get to briefly later in this episode is meant to differentiate the components that make up an initiative. So an initiative is sort of broad, a collaborative effort between various people with different backgrounds, interests, skills, etc. A component project is a little bit more focused. It could be a coding project. It could be a documentation project. It could be a user interface design project. It could be a logo or other graphic elements project, and so on. So you can check that out. And by the way, if you are not a GitHub person, these are just websites. You can click on links. You can read words. You don't need to be a coder. Yes, GitHub is aimed at enabling software project development, but it can be used for so many more things. So in this case, you can just read. You can read about Agile for Volunteers. And remember that everything is always a work in progress. So nothing is done. It rarely ever is. spot a typo, spot a confusing passage. It's always subject to revision, especially based on input from others. It's like finding bugs and then fixing them. So let's begin first with some progress on Agile for Volunteers. Now, Agile for Volunteers was something we've been talking about we've been around for over 2 years, since our early days, rebooting Code for Vegas. And it was something that seemed to make sense based on the comings and goings of individuals. And in some cases, people believe that they were to be told what to do. And I would remind people that they're not employees. They don't work for a manager. I am not their boss. The thing about Agile in general, the original Agile Manifesto and the Agile principles, mostly it's about whole team, about collaboration, about having input on the development path. Of course, Agile is rooted in software development, but in general, not being told what to do, but collaborating as a part of a whole team. Because we're all volunteers, there really isn't the notion of a manager or a managerial hierarchy. Sure, there are project managers, if you like. There are people that will take on the role of sorting through the bugs, triaging issues, making sure the Agile workflow components are up to date and current, helping to keep track of progress and so on. And it's important to keep track of those things because volunteer time is valuable. So we need to provide a way for people to see that, oh, I'm not wasting my time. I am participating in this undertaking like everybody else is. So ideally making that visible or making it observable and enabling, encouraging people to participate as peers, as members of a team, not as workers being told what to do is an important notion. And it's where the Agile for Volunteers idea began. It was a single, rather lengthy, but single, very much first draft document as part of the general organization how-tos, or like, welcome to the now Innovate for Vegas Foundation. Here's how to get started. Here's some principles and notions and best practices, or at least the practices we'll follow, and so on. So one document, I believe it's called Agile, but now it's been exploded into a separate component project of our infrastructure initiative for the Innovate for Vegas Foundation, and we can be a little bit more detailed. We can explore, invest, and smart with regard to user stories and tasks. We can describe, go into more detail about some of these ideas, why they matter, how they fit together, a glossary of ubiquitous language to be expanded. And you are welcome to visit the link as I've described it. You can find it in the episode description. Keep in mind, even as I'm speaking now, there are several things that will be committed. They'll be added to the documentation component project today, ideally. I was working on them at, 2 o'clock this morning, 3 o'clock this morning. So I will go over them in the morning light or in the daylight and add them to the project. Mostly workflow tools to make use of the GitHub issue, discussion, pull request components, features that are useful for managing projects with multiple people contributing. And again, not everything is software, so we want to make sure that someone who's not a programmer can participate in the user story workflow for defining, describing what we're building, what is the initiative all about, and then actually implementing whatever it is that they want to work on, whether it's logos, artwork, software, documentation, testing plans, etc. So hopefully the Agile for Volunteers component of our infrastructure will eventually evolve through some iteration and some feedback from actual people, will evolve into a useful methodology to make the most of volunteer time. And it's important to realize that, I hate to underscore this too many times, but people are not getting paid, so their time must be valued, and they must find value, and they must find a return on their investment of time, effort, and expertise that make projects go. When they bring that to initiatives, they should be able to recognize the value that they're adding and whatever it is that they get back from that, a very personal motivation, usually some satisfaction for spending time well on a valuable potential outcome down the road. And it's important to recognize the symmetry of these volunteer efforts, time, effort, and expertise. Any given, so in a in a workplace, there is the notion that a manager will, my manager will tell me what to do. I must work to satisfy my manager so that my manager can talk to their manager and do the same. And this is probably where Agile has gone wrong over the years. It's been turned into a reporting tool up a chain, managing up, as they say. So if we can, instead of doing that, realize that there are no managers. There are, as far as hierarchy, there are responsibilities to manage a project or an initiative, but there are no I was going to say leaders. There are certainly leaders. There's no one telling you what to do. And so one of the principles of the Agile for Volunteers implementation is to make that clear, or at least visible. The use of the iteration pattern in Agile, that is taking a block of time, we start with 2 weeks. So an iteration of 2 weeks and some information interchange patterns in the way of issue and discussion form. So these are the things that I will add to the Agile for Volunteers component project after I publish today's episode of this program. Will ideally steer some of the asynchronous interactions that will be inherent in a loose volunteer organization. We're not paying people for their daily stand-up meetings, so they're not required, they're not compelled. They might be compelled a little bit, but only out of their own good graces to actually spend time on a schedule. But normally, in a volunteer project, people can volunteer some time, effort, and expertise when they have them to offer, not necessarily between the hours of 9 and 5 p.m. People might be in different time zones, have different day-to-day commitments, be working on other things. But hopefully they will be able to see how their contributions make sense in the bigger picture. And hopefully we can see who's working on what and when and how and what they need, where they're stuck and so on, without requiring something like a daily stand-up, which is common. It's probably the most disliked aspect of Agile in a workplace is too many meetings. And so ideally we can do away with meetings, but we can also make use of some structure in how we capture what we intend to do and as we do it, so that someone jumping in, peering over the wall at the undertakings of the various participants in our various initiatives and component projects, someone should be able to look over and say, oh, I could probably contribute something to this today, this week, this month, over a period of time. So that's one of the aspects of the tessellation project, the tessellation initiative that we are trying to pursue, is to make it easy or easier for someone who wants to offer some time, effort, or expertise. And I'm using those three things together because I think often it is only, volunteer time. But you actually do things with your time, so you expend effort, and you probably bring some level of expertise to what you are offering. And it's important to value all of those things, all three. So I probably won't repeat them as a trio every single time, but it is important to realize that volunteering does have at least those three components, and they should be recognized. So in our loose volunteer organization, it's important to be able to see who's doing what so that we can coordinate our time. You know, if I only have 10 hours a week total out of, what's 7 times 24? 168 hours. Is that right? If I only have 10 hours a week out of my, busy week, I'd like to make the most of those. I don't want to spend 5 of those hours trying to figure out who's working on what should where can I jump in? who needs my expertise to address a particular problem, who's getting slowed down because maybe they don't know how, something functions. Maybe I'm a graphic artist and somebody needs some help with a particular creation tool, some image editing or some object oriented like SVG, scalable vector graphics. Maybe somebody who doesn't have quite the background in object artwork could use some help, and maybe I know exactly how to help that. So being able to connect people with their willingness to contribute their time, effort, and expertise with the limited time available is part of what the Tessellation initiative hopes to enable. And Agile for Volunteers may, ideally, be one of the tools and methods that we can apply to something like Tessellation so that people will understand where they can add their trio and make the most of it and get something back for it. So speaking of the tessellation, by the way, is a mosaic, and the idea is to create a literal mosaic, tiles, of organizations, cohorts that are operating independently but are connected through, connection, communication, and collaboration. So if you imagine a national network of civic volunteer cohorts, they could be individuals, they could be groups of informally gathering individuals. They can have various skill sets, not all about code. They could be nonprofits. They could be just people with some time and some interest. So there's no reason to not enable anyone who wants to be a part of the network graph of civic volunteerism. And of course, make those people visible, make those groups visible, the cohorts. So the mosaic of logos or other visualization representations of these cohorts, kind of what's going on there. And of course, managing the gathering of not only the logos, the visualization, but knowing who is where, which cohorts are where, who knows whom, and opting into this network graph of connection, communication, and collaboration. So once you jump into the tessellation, you should be visible as a node. It's not intended to be diminishing the value of participation, but you're a tile in a mosaic, literally in this case, but it's a representation of the connection and the ability for people to collaborate across localities. Someone in another place could innovate for Vegas just as well as someone in Vegas. And in fact, something we are working on might come in handy for something that they are working on, even though we're not in the same place. So being able to connect with people and being able to visually celebrate, if you will, are some of the goals of the Tessellation initiative. And it's a prototype deployment of Agile for Volunteers, which is so much the better. Our first Agile for Volunteers iteration will take place on the first theme of the Tessellation to build a tool that will be used locally to manage the opt-in files, FOF and DOPE. These are RDF schema and files that I have described in previous episodes. Friend of a friend to connect individuals and organizations that know each other. And DOPE, description of a project, DOAP, to describe the individual component projects that make up an initiative. So it's too bad there's not a description of initiative. We might, because of the nature of RDF, the resource description framework, we can create our own. We can add a initiative file to the mix, and we'll see. We're getting ahead of ourselves here. So an individual cohort can advertise who they are, who they know, how they're connected, what they're working on. And we can create a visualization, but more usefully, an actual connection or interconnection network graph. So you can see who knows whom, who you can talk to, where you can find out more about what they're working on, and so on. So you no longer must search through slide presentations or Google search for a civic volunteer project, or look through GitHub or GitLab for the information is available, but you can, if you have those 10 hours and you spend 9.5 of those hours trying to figure out who's working on what that you might be able to help with, you've misspent that valuable time. Given the tessellation project is intended to enable and encourage connection, communication, and collaboration across the civic volunteer network, inviting participation in this project, making use of Agile for Volunteers tools and methods, will be proof of concept of sorts. It might also invite participation in the Agile for Volunteers idea. As with everything, tessellation and Agile for Volunteers included, evolutionary discussion, iteration, good ideas turning into better ideas, and so on is always a possibility. Nothing should be viewed as written in stone. That's the joy of, and if you're not familiar with what GitHub or Git or any of a slew of version control tools that have been in use in the software industry for decades, it's a way to make a change to something. If you're familiar with your typical Office document, if you are sharing a document with your team or one other person, maybe you are working on a document, maybe an agenda, maybe it could be anything. You make a change, someone else makes a change, and you say, "Oh, let me see who made which changes over what, when did this get updated or changed or deleted? Show me crossed out text that was removed, and highlight the text that was added, and so on and so on." Same exact thing. So there's nothing really mysterious or magic about GitHub from that perspective. So the casual person, regardless of coding proclivities, can make use of a tool like this. So if we have the ability for people to say, I didn't think that this approach to the iteration outcome measurement was ideal, we can do better. Well, by all means, let's discuss, let's roll it in, let's integrate it. Maybe we can make things better. The measurement of achievement or difficulty of the work involved, or any number of ways of looking at it, of an agile iteration is a point of contention. The story point, the scheme of story points and of velocity and so on, these are also often contentious. Estimation is one of those things. People are just not good at it. And an attempt to provide some tools and methods to at least take a stab at that is something that they did when they first came up with the story points concept back in, was it 2001? February of 2001, when Agile, that's when Agile was initially typed up, the Agile Manifesto and some of the principles. And then the evolution of measurement of productivity and so on. And these things are born out of professional software engineers. We're applying Agile for Volunteers and the entire tessellation initiative to anyone working on any kinds of civic volunteer projects or initiatives, not only coders. So the notion of effort and productivity and outcomes, and when you're not getting paid to work on something 9 to 5, 40 hours a week, that changes a bit. So always open to improvement and discussion. So yeah, nothing is written in stone. And the same goes for all of our initiatives and component projects. They're always a whole team approach. If one person comes up with everything ahead of time, how can we observe potential for better, different, more effective, more useful, more easily accomplished ways of doing things if we aren't all empowered to do so? So that's a tease, I suppose, of the method. It's not a secret, though. A quick note on ubiquitous language. It's one of the principles of extreme programming that I talked about in the Polishing Agile for Volunteers episode. I think it was 2 weeks ago. If we all use the same words, if when I use the term initiative, if we know how I'm using that word because we all use it the same in the Agile for Volunteers context, right? Initiative could mean different things to different people in different vertical areas of focus. But in the case of an Agile for Volunteers scope of project collaboration, of component project collaboration, of describing the overall initiative and breaking it down into factored, achievable themes. If we all use it the same way, then we will understand what we mean when we use the term. So initiative is a little bit more abstract. So if I said, hey, we're planning a party, that might be the initiative. And the actual project is find a venue, choose a menu, decorations, send out invitations. Each of those component projects are maybe factorable into team or individual efforts. They can have different, bullet items or stories, user stories, different tasks associated to, no, user stories are with the initiative. Different tasks associated, right? Send out invitations, wait for RSVPs, send follow-up, thank you, whatever. So all the different steps, those are project components of the overall initiative. So if we keep those separate, then the initiative is not where we develop code. It's not where we create bugs. It's not where we create concrete implementations. Those are left to component projects. And that way component projects can be switched around. They can be removed. If you remove a component project, you say, hey, you know what? This was a completely, I don't want to say useless, but not quite effective way of doing something that needs to be accomplished as part of the overall initiative. You can, by keeping the component project separate from the notion of the initiative, you can dump the project, but the initiative remains. It seems like a finer point, but words do matter. If we haven't figured that out by now, we're in trouble. So use of technology, use of terminology that makes sense and is domain specific and consistently applied will help to reduce the possibility for confusion, wasted time, and so on. And again, we want to make the most of the volunteer time, effort, and expertise that they bring to initiatives and to component projects. A couple of things like blue sky versus specification versus documentation. So the Agile for Volunteers doc is a document intended for people to read. It's documentation, like a user manual. It's a helpful place, hopefully, to keep track of different ideas, different descriptions of ideas, different methodologies, tools and methods, suggestions, examples, and so on. Again, very much a work in progress, but documentation is a suggestion on how something works. A specification is not a suggestion, it's requirements. This is how it must work. Specifications are historically developed by a small group of people who don't speak to other people. And they come up with this thing, and I've talked about this previously as well, the engineering requirements specification. If you write that first and then you tell people, here's what you're working on, they may get a sense that when they find a problem, they have to solve it, rather than raising their hand perhaps and saying, hey, there's probably a better way to do this. So that's not documentation, but that is a whole team approach to improving the initiative and its component projects and how people accomplish those projects. Now, in a paid professional developer, professional contributor context, things get a little different, right? I mean, you're being paid to do something. Okay, well, I guess I'll do it, even if it takes 3 times as long as it could. But in a volunteer context, we don't have that. We don't have that money to throw around. We don't have their time to waste. So ideally, we can take the notion of a specification and make it much more of a collaboration. So this is where it's blue sky versus specification. Blue sky is, let's write down some ideas. Here's what we kind of want to do. Here's why we kind of want to do it. Here's how we can kind of break it down into some possibly functional areas. So we've jotted down some ideas. If it was on a whiteboard, perhaps, or a dry erase board, that might be one way to do it, but we're not all in the same room. We're not working 9 to 5. So let's create some documents in our overview repository that say, hey, here's what we want to accomplish. Here's why we want to accomplish it. Here are some background links and existing tools and so on. Just a collection of starting points. Then we can break that down to themes. Themes, if you're creating an office suite, a theme might be a spreadsheet. Another theme might be a word processing or document tool. Another one might be a slide deck or a presentation tool. So themes are sort of top level goals, features, etc. But feature comes up later. You can create epics within themes where you group together features and you can work on those features as part of iterations. So an epic or two, or some number of epics might fit into one iteration or multiple, and each feature can be described more specifically for particular users as user stories. And so you have not a specification, but a collection of blue sky notions that have been expanded into discussable but factored. So small morsels that can be discussed and moved around and edited and split or merged, right? So you've broken it down not into a 50-page document that 1 or 2 or 10 people wrote in a room somewhere, but a collaborative effort where everyone can voice an opinion. You can have code and data and visualization and other such things. Like, what is it we're making? What are we trying to accomplish with our volunteer time? So blue sky, and then transitions into the agile hierarchy of, let's say, organizational components. And some of those components of the organization of the initiative will turn into component projects where you actually implement them. It sounds very complicated, but if you actually see the hierarchy, like, oh, okay, that makes sense. It does make sense. Initiative versus project, I've kind of touched on that. An initiative is sort of overarching and is made up of component projects. Project Act notwithstanding, it is essentially saying the initiative is what we are trying to build. The component projects are where we actually build it. So an initiative might be the recipe, and the project might be the cake in the oven. And again, that becomes more clear when you're hands-on. Like, oh, okay, I'm working on a project now. Story points, as I intimated, are a point of contention since they were conceived, only more so today. It's one way of measuring or estimating the difficulty of a particular user story points, user story. And a user story is as simple, or could be as simple as a baker, I want to read a recipe and I want to create a cake, and I will know I'm done when I stick a skewer into the cake and no uncooked batter is on it when I remove it. I remove it from the oven and it smells delightful and it comes out of the pan without breaking. Pretty simple. They can be complicated, but the idea is to not make them complicated so that they are achievable, small, doable in a week or 2 weeks in our iteration case. But not everybody is spending all 2 weeks on a project. So if that story that I just described, making a cake, has 5 story points, then someone might say, that's doable in 2 weeks. And at the end of 2 weeks, they've finished their bake a cake user story in their component project where they implemented it. They actually built, made a cake, and they went through the steps and so on. So the story points translate into actual completion, and they would say, oh, okay, I finished a 5-point story. The story points are a squishy estimation tool. And that's where we run into trouble because story points have no units. Why is that 5? Because we all agreed it's a 5. Why isn't it 4 or 7 or 100? Could be any of those. So this causes a lot of consternation for people who are not they're not familiar with the notion of loosely estimating what they can get done. And it's really it's a tool of iteration. So if if a group of people who know each other and collaborate together estimate and then apply these story points to individual user stories in the initiative, when they get to component project implementation, they'll say, oh, I'll take the 5-point user story and I'll implement it. And in 2 weeks, they've finished 5 story points. Okay, I can do 5 points in a week. So if you have a similar level of, not quite units, but similar stories that are 5 points are similarly challenging. It's not a measure of time. So you don't say, 5 points over 2 weeks. That's a certain number of fractional points per day or per hour. It's a much squishier, softer measurement. Like, okay, I know I can do 5 points in an iteration, if I needed to spend a little bit more time, or I could accomplish a little bit less or more, maybe I could take 10 points. Maybe I could do that. So it's just a sort of a yardstick or a benchmark or a tool of estimation. So, but we run into trouble in the world when story points are not used in a consistent way or are treated, as is so often the case when Agile is used as a management measurement tool. When managers use it to drive work rather than the other way around, then story points become tools of evil. So it's the lack of agreement on what story points and their use is trying to accomplish and how that I think we run into trouble. So story points is a starting point to mix uses of that word, but story points are not the end all and be all. I recently read an article that says you should treat, overall, like you should collect all of the user stories and treat progress as not a scoreable number, but a total number of stories completed over time. So you're not estimating individual story points. You're not trying to say, well, this one will take longer or requires more effort or will leverage more expertise. That's where we run into trouble, is that it's not time-based, it's not effort-based, it's something nebulous. So an attempt to make that more concrete may be successful, may be useful. We'll see. It could be subject to a discussion. And if we have more people participating in Agile for Volunteer projects with the understanding that you are not working at a paid full-time gig, not even a part-time one, so your time is valuable, what can you accomplish? How do you want to estimate what you will attempt? And how does that fit in with what other people attempt? Because if you end up working really, really hard to finish your points or whatever the system is, and someone else does not, you'll find at the end of iteration, like at the end of an iteration, like, oh, I spent all this time because I thought you were going to finish your parts and I was going to finish my parts, and then they'll fit together and then we move on to the next thing. So estimation in the context of volunteer time becomes a little bit more, I'll say, interesting, but maybe even more critical, so that one person doesn't feel like, why am I working so hard if I'm getting more done than everybody else, or vice versa, right? Still a work in progress, I promise. It's always subject to discussion and improvement, whatever we end up doing, or whatevers. There may be more than one way. The same applies to any of our initiatives. So broadly defined ideas proposed to take on particular challenges, problems, gaps, described with themes and features, factored into user stories, broken up into epics to accomplish in iterations. During iterations, component projects is where actual implementation takes place. Concrete work contributed to the overall initiative. And eventually we find, version 1. That all sounded like a word salad, but again, if you look at it as a visualization, as a hierarchy, maybe a flow chart, it's really not that tricky. It's just breaking breaking an initiative into themes, like I said, like an office suite. So let's start by working on the spreadsheet. And so what do we want to accomplish in our first epic, which is our first grouping of features? Like, we need to have a window and it needs to have a title. So all the basic, computer software stuff. If you were to break a project, like I said, a party or celebration, into themes, one might be securing a venue. One might be collecting a guest list. And then another one might be figuring out, once we have a venue and a guest list, what's our capacity of our venue and what's the ordering, I suppose, and however you want to order them, of the guests on the guest list. Because if you have 1,000 guests and your venue fits 500, well, don't forget those plus ones. So breaking up an initiative into themes allows you to say, well, we need to have this one done before that one. And in the guest list collection epics, one might be to comb through the existing phone book, the personal phone book, personal contact list. Might be also to collect related potential guests, any celebrities or officials or any VIPs, etc. So you can break down the tasks into different or task. You can break down what you're trying to accomplish during each time period. So the epic, and the epics can align with iterations, right? You say, well, we want to have a certain number of guests. And if you're planning a wedding, especially, the one side of the aisle and the other based on who knows whom, etc. So coming up with the guest list, figuring out what the overlaps are. Like, oh, we know 25 of the same people. So we can both have guests that are the same person. So you can adjust your total attendance. And so anyway, you can break down something as complicated as trying to coordinate a huge event into themes. Themes are independent of each other, but they do fit together. Sometimes they may have some interdependency. That's how life works. But themes can be broken up to accomplish the initiative. Anyway, this all sounds complicated. It's more complicated to describe, but it's actually, again, intended by using common words and common meanings behind those words to make the language of organizing volunteer time into productive time with some actual return on investment of that time. And again, time, effort, expertise, to make that more possible. Nothing is perfect, but it's a proactive step towards making people contributing the trio feel as though that was worthwhile. I would do it again. When we restructure our various initiatives, because right now they're kind of not, I'm not going to say they're thrown together, but they were not built from the ground up with a blue sky collection of ideas converted into themes and features and so on. So as we move each of our existing initiatives in that direction and we can figure everything ready to go, we can start iterations on each of our existing initiatives with component projects to implement some of the features in each particular theme and so on. So the Open Transit Initiative could have one theme being the rider tools. Hey, I ride the bus. I often say there are people who need to know how the transit system works just enough so that they know if a particular bus, train, etc. is on time so they can go pick up the person that they're meeting at the bus stop or the train station. So it's not always somebody who's riding the bus or train every day. Sometimes it's someone who's picking someone up or dropping someone off, just like airport tools. You should be able to know if the flight is on time so you can plan your trek out to the airport. Similar idea. So differentiating between someone riding the bus, between that person and a person who just needs to know when the bus is coming, what the difference is between arrival and departure times. So every vertical has its own terminology. So if we can use the same terms, so for open transit, there's operators and riders, like I said, riders and consumers. Well, operators are the bus drivers, train conductors, train pilots, whatever they are. Consumers of transit services, again, would be anybody who needs to know when a bus or train is arriving or departing, the difference between arrival and departure times, estimated versus actual times, and so on. So if we have consistent use of language in a particular domain, we make use of the jargon in appropriate ways, but not in such a way as it confuses people who are not familiar, that we can actually be productive and not waste time being confused. Like, what do you mean by rider versus operator? If we use the same terms all the time in a consistent way, then we don't spend time being confused. So I will end today's episode by suggesting that we are going to try to kick off the first tessellation iteration. Probably just me, but it's important to try out the Agile for Volunteers workflow, the patterns, the tools, see what's missing, and so on. And of course, I already know what I've put together, so I'm skewed or biased a little bit. It's always nice to have someone else taste your creation in the kitchen or elsewhere. Like a roller coaster, and you may not know this, when you build a roller coaster, the roller coaster must be able to function without people in it. So if the roller coaster has a train of cars, or I'm not using the roller coaster jargon, but if a roller coaster has a capacity in one collection of cars, can hold 20 people, 2x2 or a 2x10. Sorry. That train must operate with 0 people in it. That's how physics works. So it should work with nobody. And then you put people, maybe you put 2 people, 4 people. And in this case, we'll try 1 person instead of 0 people to start. In the future, making use of this workflow and Agile for Volunteers ideas should make it possible, perhaps easier, for someone with some time and inclination to peer into a particular initiative and its component projects, see how the iteration timelines are moving along, consider offering some of their own time, effort, and expertise. If you look at a volunteer project or initiative, but in general, in the world, you might see open source projects or open source efforts of some sort. Well, I want to help, but I don't know how should let me look at their open issues. Okay, there's only bugs. Okay, there's 3 pages of specification, but they're not really complete, and they have meetings every Thursday. Now it becomes kind of a chore, right? So without having some visibility and observability of your undertaking, and this could be a coding project, it could be a visualization project, it could be designing a user experience for an open transit application that will be used by riders and consumers of transit services. So where to jump in, how to participate when I'm not spending 40 hours a week thinking about this. So making initiatives and component projects visible to make the themes, epics, features, and user stories of the initiative visible, make the possibility of discussing, modifying, improving, factoring those components or those pieces. I don't want to use component. Components are the implementation component project. So being consistent in the use of terms and having a consistent interface to initiatives and component projects hopefully will make it easier for someone who wants to participate, be able to do so without burning up all of their time and energy trying to figure out what to do. I often say in my travels, I'd rather spend my time working than trying to work, especially if I'm getting paid. But it doesn't make sense to feel as though you are wasting your own time, especially if it's your own time. And as is the case with Agile itself, Agile for Volunteers is always subject to discussion and improvement, and perhaps changes in composition. How do we assemble the different pieces that we've described in our first pass at the sort of expanded edition of Agile for Volunteers? By kicking off early testing with an initiative that is specifically intended to foster the 3 C's, connection, communication, and collaboration, wherein someone might wish to actually follow that path and participate in the tessellation initiative in some way, or perhaps participate in Agile for Volunteers, or maybe some other initiative or some other component project. So helping people who want to help to be able to identify where they can do so to make the most of their time, effort, and expertise helps everyone. So that's what we're accomplishing, ideally, in our first go at an iteration of the tessellation initiative. And the first theme is, of course, local tools to help configure and manage the components. And FOF and DOPE are very similar to RSS. If you are a podcast listener, and it seems like you are, you're probably already familiar with RSS, the really simple syndication file. You don't need to know what's in it, but it exists. It is how audio programs, how channels and episodes can be located in the world. It's wherever you find your podcast expression comes from, because you can find them anywhere. There's a whole graph of places where the files, the MP3 or similar files, may be found. There's a whole collection of indexes and tools to help you find and share and so on. Rate. Sometimes you can give stars on iTunes, etc. So all these different value adds, but the crux of it is the RSS notion. And RSS is a little bit dated, but the version 1 of RSS was RDF site summaries. And you may have heard me mention RDF around FOF and DOPE. And it's a way to represent the connection and interconnection of things, of people, ideas, things, projects, and so on. So there's no time like the present to start work on the future. And that is where I will leave things. Don't forget to visit our homepage if you want. Don't forget we are a 501c3 public charity, our Nevada nonprofit based in Nevada. We do accept donations of any value in any denomination. Luckily, our expenses have been remarkably low in our first 2 years. Hopefully our third year, which commenced on July 1, so 23 days ago as I'm speaking at the moment. Hopefully our third year will involve more deployment of things, initiatives turning into action, and ideally people will be able to test out some of the community elevating endeavors in which we are engaged, and they will feel not obligated, but perhaps compelled. They might take an interest in supporting such things, whether they are most useful in and around the greater Vegas area or somewhere else, or both. And that is where I will leave it. Don't forget to visit the links that are in your episode description, wherever you have found this audio program. Thank you. Take care. Until next week.